stand on your 2 feet and look up to the sky. Open up your heart and let your spirit fly.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Noonan.
And I'm Roger McDermott.
And welcome back to Stepping Out. Stepping Out is a recovery program that Roger and I do. We're all in recovery for something, but a lot of people are in recovery from drugs, alcohol, workaholism. But the world needs peace and recovery. And today we're going to talk about bringing peace, hopefully. God always has a plan for peace. Roger, in Jeremiah and also in Ezekiel, they're warned about, beware of those who say peace, peace, and there is no peace. For they plaster the crack in the wall, but when the rain comes, the wall falls. And they bandage the wounds of my people so they were not serious. See, it talks about minimizing. And we for years have tried, the world has tried to bring some peace to Israel. But there's also, I believe, demonic forces that don't want any peace in Israel, and they want to destroy God's chosen people. We got a very special guest today, Roger, Jim Casparie. Jim, how are you?
I'm doing great, Bob. Roger, nice to be with you tonight.
Well, Jim, I'm so happy and pleased that Roger and I could have you on because you've written a new book, just came out. It's called God Still Has Big Plans for the Jews. Jim, reading your biography, you're an entrepreneur, you put many organizations together. And the one thing that got you over the years, because I've known Jim for years and years. We were at a local church in Yorba Linda Friends Church. We're there. You've been there for how many years? 30, 40 years now?
Probably 35, 36 years, somewhere around there.
Wow. And, but Jim, the one thing that got you is, Roger, Jim was telling me he had this, is it a CFO or CEO of your company?
CFO.
Was Jewish. And Jim got very close to him. And Jim, tell the story, because I think it's very interesting how you really, because Jim's really kind of got an evangelical heart and wants to spread the gospel, but your friend kind of resisted. Tell that story.
Yes, I appreciate that. Elliot was my CFO. I hired him from the Geneva Corporation, where he was the COO and CFO. And he came to work for me and wanted to get involved and learn more about entrepreneurism. I'm basically an incurable entrepreneur who started many, many companies over a 45 plus year career. And I needed somebody that I could trust to manage the money that was going through multiple companies. I had 2 angel investment companies. I had 1 venture capital company. I owned my own investment bank, and I was investing in multiple new companies that we were reviewing and looking to invest in. And I needed somebody I could trust. And Elliot had a phenomenal reputation. He had come to me highly recommended by a number of people that I knew and had a lot of faith in. And so he came to work for me, and ultimately he worked for me for about 24, 25 years. And I got to tell you, if you're running a company of any size, the guy that manages the money is the guy that can mess things up for you more than anybody else in the company. And Elliot was the kind of guy that I could trust with anything and everything that I had, both personally as well as in a business standpoint. And he was just the most honest and ethical and just out and out good person that I've ever met in my life. And as Bob mentioned, I grew up in the church, so I met a lot of good people. But Elliot was just somebody that I just had a special love for. And Elliot would come into my office several times during the course of the year, usually right before a major Jewish holiday. And he'd come in my office and he says, "I'm so excited. I just wrote a program for the next Passover that I'm going to share with my family. I just want to run it by you and see what you think." I go, "Sure, no problem. I have no problem with that." As a Christian, I was interested in learning more about the Jewish faith and how he believed and how he worshiped. And so we do that. And then maybe a week or two later it passed, and I go into his office and says, "Elliot, they're going to have a phenomenal program at our church. next week, and I'd just love to invite you and your wife to come and check it out with us. And he always had the same response. He says, Jim, he says, I can't come to your church. They'll recognize me before I even get to the front door. They'll know I'm a Jew, and they'll tell me, you can't come in here because your people killed our Savior. So I could never get past that. He always told me that, he appreciated me and he appreciated my faith, but it was not for him. He was totally and completely blind to anything that I wanted to share with him about Jesus.
Well, we're going to get a little more into Elliot, but what Elliot represents is kind of the barrier that Jews have, and you've talked about that. You just mentioned blindness. We'll get into that in a little bit, but Jim, when you talk about the 5 things are clear from your study of Scripture, that God selected the Jews to what? Be his chosen people.
Even more than that, if you go into it a little bit more, I mean, God also said that he chose the Jews to be the firstborn of his earthly family. And so to be the firstborn is significant in the Jewish faith, because the firstborn always inherits a double portion and always becomes the leader of the family as the family moves on. And as the parents die, the firstborn is the one that picks up the mantle and carries the family cross literally forward. And that was a very important thing that as I studied more about this, the the motivating basis for me is that I had to, when I retired, I had to come to grips with something that I didn't want to have to come to grips with. And Elliot was moving to the East Coast. I wasn't going to have my close connection with him anymore. And I had this epiphany where the Lord asked me the question. He says, what's going to happen to Elliot? What are my plans for Elliot? So I went to my pastor and asked him that question. And, like all good Christian pastors, he asked one question: does he believe in Jesus? Answer was no, absolutely not. And then the answer didn't take any more than 5 nanoseconds to come out of his mouth. And he says, well, then he's going to hell. And I go, I mean, this guy's a better Jew than I'm a Christian in terms of how he practices his faith, and he's faithful in going to the synagogue. He's faithful in observing all the Jewish festivals. He takes active responsibility for instructing his son and his wife and keeping them in the faith. And I just said, there's no way Elliot is going to hell. I mean, this guy is just too good a Jew. And so if I started studying and started opening up my mind to what God's plan was for the Jews. So it wasn't just Elliot. I knew other Jews that practiced their faith very, very sincerely and very diligently. And I go, there's got to be a way that God's chosen people, God's firstborn of his own earthly family, are not going to be subject to being condemned to hell for eternities, just simply because they did not recognize Jesus. And of course, we read in Romans 9 through 11 that God made the Jews blind. That's why I use the word blind for Elliot, is because the Jews were made blind by God to not recognize Jesus as Messiah. And he did that for a purpose, because if he hadn't done that, the Jewish religion, or the Christian religion under Jesus, could have been completely and totally separate for the Jews, had it not been for what I call the fork in the road, where the Jews basically said, I cannot accept Jesus, because to do that, I've got to give up on asking Gentiles to be circumcised. I got to give up on asking Gentiles to, not be concerned about what food they eat and what practices they practice in their daily lives. And if they refuse to go to synagogue and refuse to make sacrifices, as we've done for thousands of years, then, I can't accept them to be Christians in the sense of accepting Jesus. So Jews went one way, and the Gentiles went the other way. And by doing that, God opened a door that allowed all the world to see and accept Jesus.
So the gospel went out to the Gentiles. So, but the Bible's pretty clear. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. You even write that in your book. And nobody comes to the Father but through me.
That's exactly right. And that's the stumbling block. And so I say, in my book, I say that there's a blindness among the Jews, but there's also a blindness among the Christians. Because what happened,
Right.
when you talk to a lot of Christians, and they're people like me, they're brought up in the church, and they got the same basic New Testament book to study, and it says, "I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except by me. If you don't accept Jesus, you're not going to go to heaven." And so, what are we going to do with that? Well, there's a concept called supersessionism. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. And
Yes,
supersessionism
yes.
basically teaches among biblical scholars that at the cross there was a separation, and the separation was is that the Jews lost their inheritance because they rejected Jesus, and that inheritance transferred over to the Gentiles. So now the Gentiles are supposedly the ones to inherit the promised land, and the Jews are cut out of the picture.
Yeah, Roger, there's a whole new thinking today that Christians are the new Israel in Jerusalem, right, Jim?
That's what
And so,
supersessionism would teach: is that a Gentile Christian
right,
is the new Israel, and
right.
that, that is something
But see,
that
the problem I have with that is the 7,000 promises that God gives Israel, and I mean, there's thousands of promises in the Old Testament, and we're seeing those. I know Hal Lindsey was a dear friend of mine, and he passed a few months back. But he said there's only a couple prophecies that have not been. Everything's ready to go right now, and so we'll have to see. But when you look at all the covenants, that God made with Israel, and so I think you're right. Oh, I know you're right, because all you got to do is read Revelation, and you see how God saves Israel
well,
and redeems them.
not exactly, because I think that that's not quite obvious. And one of the things that has bothered me for years, and I didn't really know the answer to it, but I don't know how many books on the Book of Revelation you've read, but you mentioned Hal Lindsey, and he was certainly a big influence on me. And I loved his book, The Late Great Planet Earth. When he wrote it, I thought it was fantastic, and so did a lot of people. I came from the Jesus Revolution time period, and even Hal Lindsey, out of all the books I've read on Revelation, not one of them will give any credence to chapter 7 of the book of Revelations. They'll say that chapter 7 is allegorical, chapter 7 is symbolic, chapter 7 means nothing significant to the story of Revelations, and yet the first 9 verses of chapter 7 of the book of Revelation says there's 144,000 Jews that are named by 12,000 unit segments by tribe, every single one of them in the book of Revelations. And everyone seems to ignore that. But they also ignore something else. And we don't have to go to Old Testament prophecies to get something that will tickle your fancy and maybe make you think a little bit. And that says that in Revelations chapter 15, we basically have Satan's been defeated. He's been cast into the lake of fire. So is the beast and the Antichrist and all this sort of stuff. And there's a great big celebration going on in heaven on the glass sea that's right in front of the throne of God. And the celebration includes the following audience: Jesus, all of the heavenly angels, and a group of people that are singing a song of celebration over the conquest of Satan. And what song are they singing? Well, they're actually singing two, but the first one's the most important. They're singing the
The
song
Song
of
of Moses.
Moses. And the only other time, first of all, what group of people could actually know the words to that song except Jews? Because I'm sure I don't know them, and I doubt that you and, with all due respect to you and Roger, I doubt you know it. We couldn't sing that song, and then the only other time that song was sang was after God closed the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, over Pharaoh and his army, and after Pharaoh was completely defeated, and the Jews celebrated the defeat of Pharaoh and sang the song of Moses. And it's being sung a second time in the 15th chapter of Revelations. And who would sing that song other than the Jews? One other thing is chapter 19 of the book of Revelations, it talks about the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem, which are made of various precious stones, and each one named after an apostle. But then there are 12 gates to the New Jerusalem, and each one of the 12 gates is named after one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Why would you do that if you are basically excluding the Jews from any kind of position in the new heaven and the new earth, and the redemption of God's chosen people at the end of the age?
So are you saying that all Jews will be saved, or there's a remnant like Abraham, he was justified through faith?
Yes. There are three remnants, and that's a very important word. And I think most Christians don't understand the concept of the remnant. But in First Kings, Elijah, after he defeated Baal, if you recall, he went off in the desert, and he was really sad and really depressed, because he says, "I'm the only one left, Lord, that even honors you and even believes in you." And God said, "No, there's a remnant of 7,000 people who still will not bow down to Baal, who still believe in me and still follow my ways." And that was called the faithful remnant. And then in the New Testament, we have the Jews, and there's still Jews today. We call them completed Jews. I don't think the Jews like that term, but the completed Jew is the person who's born a Jew, grew up being Jewish, and accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, and now they're a believing Jew who've given their life over to Jesus and are saved. So that's the saved remnant, or the believing remnant. And then the final remnant is the blind remnant. And the blind remnant is the one I think that is the most least understood about how God is going to save the Jews. And that's primarily what my book is all about. God does have a plan, in fact, a big plan to save the Jews. And it's something that I believe that God has revealed to me in a very special and spiritual way. And I truly believe that he asked me to write this book. He gave me the vision for how to interpret the scriptures, and I'm excited about it, because if nothing else, it makes me feel really, really good about my friend Ellen.
Yeah. Well, it should, and I've always encouraged my friends to go to a Seder, go, because I've been invited. You ever been to one, Roger?
Yes.
You've been to one, right, Jim? And we can learn so much. It's not just symbolic, but it's a wonderful tradition. But Jim, how do we as Christians build a bridge to the Jewish community and love them?
Well, for me, in my path, I think, is not an unreasonable path. It's a path of saying that, we have a Bible that contains 66 books. And in those, 37 of those books are in the Old Testament. And it takes 2/3 of the volume of our Holy Scriptures, which we call universally, not just the Old Testament, not just the New Testament. The whole book is called the inspired Word of God. And yet I feel that we have to reconnect with our understanding of the Old Testament, reevaluate how we see God's commitment to and vision for the Jews. As you pointed out, Bob, I mean, we have all kinds of covenants that God made with Abraham, and he made with, well, starting with Noah with the rainbow after the flood, then with Abraham, and then with Jacob and Israel, and then with Moses and with David, and all these covenants that were made throughout the Old Testament. Do we ignore those? Was God not serious? Some people will even go so far as to say, if God cannot keep his word to the Jews, then how can we as Christians believe that he'll keep his word with us? And so I think part of building this bridge is to understand that God has a foundational love for his chosen people, the Jews. And we need to reconnect with that. We need to understand the level of commitment, the level of love that goes behind that, and to understand that God sees the Jews as his firstborn. He's not going to abandon them. He's not going to let them reject Jesus and get away with it. I mean, if you think about it, the Old Testament, the Jews constantly rejected God and traded him for what? A false idol. Then in the New Testament, the Jews reject Jesus and trade him for what? God the Father. So if the Jews are trading Jesus for God the Father in the New Testament, won't God and Jesus forgive that over the repeated rejection that they did in the Old Testament, where they traded him for a false god, an idol?
Right. But I do remember when Moses went up Sinai and he comes down and Aaron has made a golden calf, right? And they're celebrating. We've all seen Charlton Heston come down the mountain and throw the tablets and fire and brimstone. But it was almost like you know, those who want to follow God come over to my side, and those that wanted to stay by the golden calf, they died that night. And, as Joshua said, choose this day who you are going to serve. As for me, I will serve the Lord in my family. And so when we see God, oh man, I was reading Jeremiah 6 today and Ezekiel 13, and God is just coming down. I'm going to destroy you, and I'm bringing your enemies in to obliterate you. And, um, it wasn't very pleasant. I'm going to scatter you. Um, but what happens is the story of Nehemiah. So he's in Babylon. How would you like to have his job, Jim? He's the taster for the king, right? So if anyone dies first, it's Nehemiah. But it also tells me that the king trusted him. And that one day he comes in and his brothers had told him what's going on in Jerusalem and how the gates are torn down and the graves of their fathers are overturned. And Azaractus said, Nehemiah, you look sad, but I know you're not sick. What's going on, basically? He says, well, why wouldn't I be? He tells the truth. And he said, this is what's happened in Jerusalem. And the king says, what do you want to do about it? You see, sometimes when we tell somebody with some good authority, we can get a good answer. And he says, I want to go and rebuild. Now, Jim and Roger, there's nothing in Nehemiah's portfolio and his resume that says he's a contractor, okay? He just wanted to go build. King says, okay, what do you need? He goes, I just need letters so I can get across enemy territory. That's when the king says, no, I'm sending my army with you. Now, I think for all of us men, especially, when we cross enemy territory, we need to have an army with us, the guys we go to Bible study, the guys that we pray with all the time, whatever that is. But I'm thinking there's another promise. God took them away for 70 plus years, and then he's going to restore Israel.
Well, and we also have another thing that occurs to me when I went through the study is that, what was the reason why God called Israel into this assignment to take on the role of being his chosen people? And the answer to that is that God gave the Jews what sometimes we refer to in business as a stretch goal. Okay. He gave them a stretch goal. In fact, it was such a big stretch goal that it was impossible for them to be able to complete, because he says, I want you to be an example to the world of who I am. I want you to be holy because I am holy. And they couldn't do it. And every time they tried to do it, sometimes when your boss asks you to do something and he's asking you to do something that you just don't think you can do, you can get really depressed and possibly even not be able to complete the job because you just don't think you can do it. But other people will rise to the challenge. And the Jews occasionally rose to the challenge and other times got depressed and fell back. And, Nehemiah had a tremendous job to go back and build the walls of Jerusalem. And, that's the problem that we have in the way we see the Jews. We don't seem to understand and appreciate that God gave them such a stretch goal that he knew was impossible, and that he knew eventually could only be accomplished by his son Jesus. And so when Jesus came to do what they could not do, they had a hard time. In fact, they couldn't accept what he did for them because they were unable to let go of their history, tradition, and heritage. And anybody who knows a Jew, there's nothing that means more to them than their history, tradition, and heritage. That is so important to a Jew, more so than any of us, because it is everything that they are and everything that they live for.
I was going to say tradition. We've all seen Tavia and Fiddler on the Roof. And you really get a good sense of, their commitment to Old Testament scripture and the Old Testament God. Raj?
I'm loving this discussion. I'm excited about your commentary, basically about the 144,000 and the fact that they look like they're going to be super evangelists in the end times, and there's no comment about how many people will be converted, but obviously there's going to be a lot of people that are converted that are alive still in the time of tribulation.
That means so much to me, Roger. I think that's just a huge point, because when the Christians talk about the rapture, whether you're pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, and there's a few that I guess still think post-tribulation. I happen to be a mid-tribulation guy, but you talk about the rapture and we get all excited. We said, yeah, things are getting so bad around this world. Come Jesus now, just rapture us today and we'll be out of this mess. And we don't think about what's going to happen, because if you're mid-tribulation rapturous and all us Christians get taken off the earth, so to keep us from having to go through all that harshness of the latter half of the tribulation, there's still people on the planet. There's still people that can be saved. And we have two prophets, but those prophets are not there to save anybody. They're there to accuse the Antichrist for being who he is and what he is and where he came from. And all they do day and night in Jerusalem is they tell everybody what a horrible, evil person the Antichrist is. They eventually kill him. After trying to do it for most of the 3.5 years, they finally get him to die, only temporarily. But who's going to bring the gospel message to those people that remain after the rapture? And the answer to that question, Roger, exactly what you just said, is there's 144,000 Jews that are going to be given that task.
Or should we call them the chosen people are given that task?
Yes. Well, and the question is, and I don't answer this in my book, but it's one that people ask, well, how were the 144,000 chosen? And we don't know that, but I assume that all of the 144,000 are what we call part of the blind remnant. They were exposed to Jesus during their life, and it says in Hebrews that they lived their life in expectation and in hope that the Messiah would come. And they died.
Well, Jim, let me ask you this. Most of the time when I've read this when I was a young Christian, I don't know why I thought this, but help me with this. I thought all the 144,000 are coming from Israel. I'm wondering if 144,000 are Jews scattered around the world plus Israel.
I would take the latter, Bob. I really would. And the reason for that is because, at the exile, we know that first the Assyrians conquered the Israel, which was the 10 tribes. And Assyria took those 10 tribes and basically dispersed them throughout their empire. And so we call those the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Nobody knows where they are. Through the miracle of DNA and DNA tracing, I think some people are starting to find out where some of those tribes might have ended up, but that's another story. But the 10 tribes are the lost tribes. The other, Judah, only represented the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. And so we had those two tribes. We had to preserve Judah because we had to have the line of David to trace through to Jesus, so we couldn't lose that tribe. So that's why it got split off apart as a separate entity. Some people wonder that, but the Babylonians conquered Judah, who was occupying Jerusalem at the time, and King Nebuchadnezzar was a benevolent conqueror because he took them back to Babylon and he gave people like Nehemiah, responsible roles, and he didn't torture them probably too much. Probably had a few people they didn't like, but for the most part, the two tribes of Judah were preserved, and that's another side of the coin. So when we talk about the 144,000, I won't go into the fact that if you go through the list is not the same 12 tribes that you would read as the sons of Jacob, or otherwise referred to as Israel in the Old Testament. But and one of the significant substitutions is Levi, which is normally not included as one of the 12 tribes, is one of the 12 tribes listed in chapter 7 of the book of Revelation.
Right.
All of a sudden, you have a priestly tribe
Hmm.
involved in this campaign to preach the gospel to the most rebellious
Wow.
and most evil
Wow.
people ever to walk the face of the planet.
So, Jim, let me ask you this, because come up to current days, there's a blindness that you said that God gave the Jews. And I think there's a supernatural evilness that Satan is using to get the world to hate Israel. And it's been that way since the beginning, the founding of Israel. From Moses, the Exodus, having Israel, and how many times were they attacked? The enemy has wanted to destroy every person in Israel. And we saw it in World War II. We're seeing it today with little slogans like "from the river to the sea." But we know that God is not going to allow anyone to wipe out his chosen people. And I think, I was telling Jim the other day, I have a couple dear friends that are Christian, and they're angry at Israel, and they're saying Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. When the world knows that Hamas is actually, how do you fight a war with terrorists that hide under schools and hospitals, have killed 1,200 that one day and took hostages? This is a supernatural evil, Jim.
Well, it is. And, this is the same people that God, remember when the Jews came into the promised land, God said, you have to conquer this land. You cannot allow any of the people who occupy this land today to live. You cannot marry the women. You cannot preserve the children. You go into a town, you kill the women, you kill the children, you kill the men, you kill the animals, you kill everything. Nothing survives. And it seems extremely barbaric, but that was God's instruction to the people of Israel in the Old Testament when they came into the promised land. And he says, I'm giving you this land, but this land has to be like you. It has to be pure. It has to be holy.
The three things that God told the kings of Israel not to do when they conquered is don't take silver or gold. I want to be the value of your nation. The second one is don't take their horses. I want to be the power of your army. And the third was don't take wives from foreign countries that worship idols. David did really good on the first two.
Well, Solomon was much worse than David.
Yeah, well, yes, but he learned from his father.
I'm not, well, yeah, he learned from his father, but not to your point, Bob, not the very best lesson. He didn't learn
No.
it properly.
Yes, because at the end,
he definitely.
the one thing he had Solomon promises, do not build idols to foreign gods. And at the end, he allowed his wives to do that. So, Jim, where do we go from here? What do you want people to really understand your heart, the text of your book?
What I want people to understand is that there is a reason why the Jews are persecuted. There's a reason why the Jews are hated. Can you hear me? Okay. And we need, as Christians, more than any other group of people on the planet, we need to extend these people some love and some understanding and some appreciation for who they are in the God context, not the world context, but in the God context. Because these were the people that God called to be his representatives on earth. And it's kind of like, some of us Christians get a reputation of being, quote, holier than thou, and people don't like it when we do that, and it's not a good look on us. And yet the Jews were basically, their mission was to be that. And that is what caused a lot of people to not like them that much. And they also were very successful. I mean, another thing that tends to make people jealous of the Jews, one reason why I had a CFO as a Jew helping me build my business is they're very, very sharp and shrewd when it comes to business. And a lot of people don't like them for that because we always want what somebody else has. We always hate what other people's successes are. And the Jews are very successful for the most part. They're very religious in their own right, and we don't understand it. And people don't like those things about the Jews. And as Christians, I think we need to reach out and show them a little bit of love.
I think you're absolutely right. On the other hand, one of my favorite guys in the world is a gentleman named Dennis Prager, who gets the most angry at his fellow Jews that have become secular. And he says there's a blindness to some of them. So I guess what you're telling me is none of the 144,000 are coming from Hollywood.
Probably not. And at the end,
I'm just kidding.
I'm going to say, I don't want to talk about it over this podcast because it would, kind of, you never want to give away the last chapter of a book.
Yeah.
And the last chapter of my book is really how this all comes together. There's some very, very interesting, I think, very miraculous, it's the very special and heartwarming things that God does for his people in the latter days that nobody's really written about. I will say this, when you write something that goes against what the mainstream biblical scholars teach and what you read in most other books that are being published on biblical eschatology and prophecy, you get a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit timid about, sharing it with other people. So I prayed about this, and I was blessed that I was able to get a guy by the name of Dr. Peter Lundell. Peter is a PhD from Fuller Theological Seminary, and he agreed to edit my book. And so he went through every single line in my book and made comments and edit notes on it, and repeatedly told me, he says, I never thought of this before. This is a whole brand new concept. I love this. This is amazing. And at the end of the day when he finished editing my book, I asked him, do you believe in my concept enough to let me put your name on my book? And he said, absolutely. So I have a Fuller Theological Seminary graduate, pastor of his own church in San Diego, author of 7 books, and a good guy that I love dearly, helped me to get the message in this book out in a much more clear and concise fashion.
So how do we get your book? Because I'm going to read it. I love your commentary on the chosen people. And it only follows, right, Jim, that if these are God's chosen people, he's not going to drop them in the grease and abandon them.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, I follow that.
So I'm on Amazon, Roger. I've got a hardcover, a paperback, and Kindle version. I have a website called its-a-god-thing.blog. And on that website, we have you can read online through a 3D flip book version of my book. So it's sort of like a Kindle. And for people, particularly people overseas that don't have Kindle or don't use Kindle or can't get Kindle, you can buy it on my website for that particular format. I will tell you one thing. As an author, this is actually my second book. My first book is still yet to be published because I think that's typical of a lot of authors. You write something and then you look at it and you go, yeah, that really isn't that good. I'm not going to do that. So I put it on the shelf and I'm still working on it. This is my second book. But since I didn't know any better, I thought, well, I'm going to be really transparent the way I write my book. I want people to know that anything that's in black ink is my thoughts and my words. Anything in blue ink is coming right out of the Bible, and I'll tell you which version or translation I've used so that you can see the blue ink that's coming out of the Word of God. Anything in red ink that's not for emphasis purpose is coming out of a reference book that I'm citing to give credence to some of the things I'm saying, some of the more difficult concepts. I've got other people to weigh in on some of the things that need to be weighed in on. So, and a lot of the tables and illustrations that I've used, I hired a professional illustrator out of Canada that did a phenomenal job of illustrating my book. She did several custom illustrations to try and get the concepts across, and we wanted to do it full color. So this is a long way of saying my paperback is $45, my hardcover is about $50, and the Kindle is $9.99. So the best value is the Kindle.
Hey, Jim, thanks for taking the time. Again, the book is titled by author Jim Casparie, God Still Has Big Plans for the Jews.
I appreciate both of you guys. Thank you so much. God bless.
Don't grind them gears no more. You don't need another score. Don't try to run away. It's the dawn.